Good afternoon, everyone. The committee will come to order. It is good to be able to welcome you all this afternoon. Although Congresswoman Radewagen, I think it's probably your good morning there, so we will just say good day to everyone. As folks may know, we've had a whole series of hearings on the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic over the past several weeks. We've looked at the impact on the energy sector, on our mineral supply chains, on wildfire preparedness. But today we're going to take a closer look at the virus's impact on the territories, at the implementation of existing law aimed at mitigating and preventing its spread, and its potential legislation that could benefit the territories in the future. All of our states face challenges in fighting the spread and the impact of COVID-19, but I think it's fair to say that the territories face additional hurdles. You've got limited capacity to handle a health pandemic, to economies with fewer sources of revenue that are severely harmed by the economic shutdown, particularly those that are dependent upon tourism, and that's where I can certainly relate to USVI, to Puerto Rico, Guam, American Samoa, CNMI. These are all areas that see flux of folks with tourism. Although the territories have limited ports of entry for the virus to arrive at their islands, the reality is that the virus spread well before travel restrictions were in place. And of course, once it's on an island, it's difficult to contain. American Samoa is the only jurisdiction to keep the virus from reaching their shores. And while we certainly hope that remains the case, we don't take anything for granted nowadays. Congress has passed 4 funding bills to address the COVID-19 outbreak, and while I know these bills do not contain everything that everyone wanted to have included, we did seek to ensure that the measures work for the territories where federal programs are not necessarily implemented in the same manner as the states. The Families First Coronavirus Response Act increased Medicaid funding for the territories and lowered the territories' Medicaid match rate. It provided additional SNAP funding and supplemental funding for those territories that utilize block grant funding instead of traditional SNAP. The CARES Act included language to allow all territories to participate in the Pandemic Unemployment Assistance Program, regardless of whether they have unemployment insurance programs. In addition to financial assistance for governments through the Coronavirus Relief Fund, it included an additional $55 million through DOI's Office of Insular Affairs for COVID-19 needs. I think we're probably going to hear this afternoon that more is needed, and know that we will be working on that as we head into July and this next work period coming up. My hope is that today's hearing will provide us with a better understanding of what has worked so far, what needs to be adjusted, and what additional measures should be considered. So I'm pleased that we have all 5 representatives of the territories that are with us here today to lead this discussion. So before I introduce witnesses, I will turn to Ranking Member Manchin for his remarks and comments this morning.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Chairman Murkowski, for holding the hearing to discuss the impacts of COVID-19 pandemic in the U.S. territories. I want to thank all of our honorable guests for being here to help us through this, so we can help you. To date, the coronavirus pandemic has taken the lives of over 125,000 of our fellow Americans, including 166 individuals from the territories. And our heart goes out to the grieving families across the country and around the world. The scope of the committee's jurisdiction includes the 5 territories of Puerto Rico, U.S. Virgin Islands, American Samoa, Guam, and Northern Mariana Islands. I welcome our panel of witnesses that represent these 5 territories in the United States House of Representatives, and appreciate all you're joining us to share how the pandemic has impacted your island communities. Each of these governments face unique challenges based on their geographic location, import reliance, limited financial resources, and different treatment under federal programs. These circumstances create both unique problems and risk of continued challenges throughout the pandemic. The island economies are taking a hard hit as a result of the pandemic, and I sure don't need to tell any of you that. The territories were quick to react to the spread of COVID-19, and by mid-March had limited stay-at-home orders, had instituted stay-at-home orders, travel restrictions, and enhanced screening in an effort to keep the virus under control. In fact, American Samoa is the only place in the United States that has had no confirmed cases of COVID-19. And in 1918, they were able to avoid the Spanish flu pandemic, in large part due to swift action on travel restrictions and quarantine. It should come as no surprise that the beautiful territories are heavily dependent on tourism, but tourism has come to a halt as we attempt to flatten the curve. Unfortunately, this will not change anytime soon as we continue to urge social distancing and discourage travel during the ongoing global pandemic. This year, adding insult to injury, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration is predicting a busy hurricane season in the Atlantic in the midst of the pandemic. The territories have been hit by severe natural disasters, including hurricanes, typhoons, and earthquakes in recent years. Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands are still recovering from the 2017 hurricanes that wreaked havoc in the islands and caused over $140 billion in damages. Hurricane and disaster preparation are crucial during this time of year, and especially this year, given we have a global pandemic on our hands, too. This will require an entirely different approach from both emergency managers and the public. Although the local and federal government have been working hard to recover and rebuild, more needs to be done to prepare for natural disasters amid COVID-19. Over the past few months, Congress has passed 4 pieces of legislation providing authority and funding necessary for COVID-19 relief and recovery efforts. This has resulted in over $2 trillion in new direct spending for the U.S. Department of Treasury, the Small Business Administration, and the Department of Health and Human Services, and many other federal agencies and entities. We worked hard to ensure that the territories were included and eligible for the funding and the various federal programs engaged in the response to the pandemic. For example, the territories received $2.5 billion in the Coronavirus Relief Fund, $2.2 billion in the Paycheck Protection Program, and $35.5 million in the Provider Relief Fund, $55 million in the Office of Insular Affairs Technical Assistance Program, direct payments to individuals and families, and additional funding from other federal agencies and entities engaged in the pandemic response. While there have been some economic relief success stories, I know our work is far from over, and I know you know it too. So as we continue to hear from our families, small business owners, nonprofits, local governments, healthcare providers, and frontline workers across the country who are not getting the help that they desperately need now. So I look forward to learning more from our witnesses about the impacts our island communities are facing and the unpredictable global pandemic. I'm hopeful that we can work together to creatively respond to the challenges facing the territories and find common sense, bipartisan solutions that lay the foundation for strong, sustainable economic growth for many years to come. Thank you, Madam Chairman. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses.
Thank you, Senator. And it is indeed a pleasure to be able to welcome to the committee, back to the committee for several of you. Those of you who have walked the long distance from the House of Representatives, we appreciate that. We also recognize that we have the ability now to not only have you live and in person, but we can also do things virtually. And so to have members that are either in their office in Washington, D.C., or in their home offices in their districts in a territory like American Samoa, we're pleased to be able to accommodate via this venue. So I am pleased to be able to, again, welcome you all and look forward to how you can educate us on the issues that have so directly impacted your constituents. We will begin this afternoon, just going off of the order on the witness list. Congressman Gregorio Kilili Camacho Sablan, who's the congressman from Northern Mariana Islands, will begin our testimony. He will be followed by Congresswoman Amata Coleman Radowagan. And as I mentioned, the Congresswoman is in American Samoa this morning. We have here in the committee room Congresswoman Stacy Plaskett with the U.S. Virgin Islands. We welcome you back to the committee. Thank you. Congresswoman Jennifer Gonzalez Colon from Puerto Rico. We're pleased that you are back before the committee again. And then Congressman Michael San Nicolas from Guam. We appreciate that you as well have joined this afternoon. I'm going to ask everyone to try to limit your comments to about 5 minutes. You're from the House side, so you're used to doing things in 1 minute, so we're giving you 5 times the talking time. But we will then have an opportunity for questions, not only from those of us here, but those members that are also online. Your full statements will be included as part of the record. So let us first begin with Congressman Sablan. If you can give us the perspective from the Northern Mariana Islands, and welcome to you.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Thanks to you and Ranking Member Manchin, the members of the committee, for taking the initiative to hold today's hearing. Moreover, thank you for the 12 years of attention and support you have all given to the Northern Mariana Islands. Thanks as well to your constituents and all the American people for the extraordinary generosity to the people of the Northern Mariana Islands, especially in this time of unprecedented crisis. This hearing is about how Congress responds to the pandemic. But even before Congress' response could reach them, the people I represent, and Mariana's government officials have to take action. They did what was needed to be safe, and they succeeded. We had 2 deaths initially, 30 cases total, but have now gone for 22 days with no new case. So far, we are keeping COVID at bay. The Marianas have a unique advantage. In a pandemic, we can seal ourselves from the rest of the world. As a matter of fact, all cases are reported on Saipan. There have been no reported cases of infection on Tinian and Rota, or from the 3 sparsely inhabited islands of Pagan, Agrigan, and Alamaga. The flip side, however, is the disadvantage we face in reviving an economy that depends, as you said, almost entirely on high-volume tourism. How can we welcome back visitors to the islands while ensuring those visitors are not bringing disease? Eventually, if there's a vaccine, we could return some semblance of the old normal, as long as visitors could reliably certify they were vaccinated. But that is a big if. I think we must face the reality that we may never again exclusively base our economy on short-term mass tourism and find alternatives. For instance, our robust cable connections and the competitive advantage of our time zone. Just this month, the Colorado-based Eitc Inc. began hiring for a cybersecurity operation in the Northern Marianas. We could grow our existing educational facilities, which already attract long-term stay students from Korea and other Asian locations. We could obtain new classes of visas that would permit longer-term second home homeowners in the Marianas. Above all, and I always say this because we have no extractable resources, no oil or gold as in, say, Alaska, Madam Chair, we must relentlessly invest in our human resources because with a better trained and more educated population, the more likely that entrepreneurial ideas will emerge that will grow wealth and well-being. And at the same time, we nurture new sources of income. We can also reduce our expenses. We can become even more energy independent and more self-sustaining when it comes to food. Governor Torres has recently taken the initiative. He brought Mariana's government and community leaders together in April to begin to search to answer the questions of where we go from here and what steps we need to take. The 2 action items the governor initially identified for Congress, we are already addressing. Direct aid to the Commonwealth government, the CARES Act provided $36 billion to cover unbudgeted pandemic costs, for example, and a waiver of local match for FEMA grants. But there will be more for Congress to do. For the long term, to facilitate the economic changes the Marianas decides on, whether that means new classes of visa, support for energy independence, or modernizing infrastructure. in the near term to prop up individuals, small businesses, and the local government, all of which had income shredded by the pandemic. And always, Congress must direct resources to healthcare, to local providers, and to researchers in national labs so that this disease does not overwhelm us. Congress has already taken extraordinary action in response to the coronavirus crisis, and the territories have not been left behind. 414 businesses in the Marianas are receiving 37 million through the Paycheck Protection Program. 70 million has been initially set up for the pandemic unemployment assistance. 49 million has been credited to Marianas taxpayers in economic impacts payments, and our schools are receiving in excess of 30 million. We're eligible for the range of grants provided by the Families First and CARES Act for healthcare, childcare, and food aid. And as mentioned, the Commonwealth government received 36 million to cover unbudgeted costs. But we cannot be lulled into believing the worst is over. In World War II, America did not declare victory after the Battle of Midway. There were still long years of struggle ahead. There could well be years of struggle before us now to ward off the coronavirus and rebuild economically. But if there is one legislation that could unleash the help we need to get us through this crisis, that is the HEROES Act that the House wrote and passed. The bill builds on policies Congress previously enacted with Families First and CARES Acts to help American families, businesses, and state and local governments through this crisis. My fellow delegates and I were listened to when the HEROES Act was drafted and passed in the House. We made sure our areas are provided for in measure equal to the needs we face. So I close by respectfully urging the Senate to take up the HEROES Act immediately, because this struggle is just starting and is far from over. Thank you for holding today's hearing and for the opportunity to testify. Thank you always for the care and attention you all have given to the American citizens residing in the territories. I look forward to working with you to ensure territories and all of America find a way through this pandemic. Thank you. I went over my time.
Congressman, thank you. I appreciate your comments this afternoon. Let us now proceed to Congresswoman Radawagan.
Thank you, Member Manchin, for holding this hearing today. I appreciate the work the ENR committee does on behalf of American Samoa and all the territories, and I'm thankful for the opportunity to testify here today. Let me begin by saying that the initial response to the COVID-19 pandemic, at least in American Samoa, has been very positive. Both Congress and the Trump administration have made great efforts to include the territories in these massive response efforts the past few months. I've included the full funding highlights along with my written testimony, but suffice it to say, American Samoa has received well over 100 million in much needed relief funding and grants through direct aid to our local ASG operations, stimulus checks, PPP and EIDL loans, and forthcoming PUA and unemployment assistance payments, all for which we are extremely grateful. With swift bipartisan congressional funding and rapid implementation by President Trump's administration, American Samoa and the country have avoided a much worse fate in this two-sided COVID war on both the health and economic fronts. We thank God every day American Samoa has remained virus-free, but we're hardly immune to the economic fallout. We're in the same boat as the rest of the country, with disruption to our churches, schools, small businesses, and local government revenues as a result. We have had no commercial air travel to and from the island since March. So due to these logistical problems, distribution of aid has had its challenges. I'm deeply thankful to Treasury, DOI, SBA, HHS, FEMA, and the other agencies for working to overcome these long distance challenges since we're more than 7,000 miles away. So please keep us in mind as Congress considers additional measures in response to the ongoing pandemic and to promote economic recovery. There are several points I want to highlight, and my written testimony provides further details on these priority health and economic needs. More COVID testing and tracing support is needed. Continued healthcare resiliency and capacity support in the areas of testing and tracing will be needed for American Samoa to reopen safely and prepare for a future crisis. Support for CDC initiatives are vital as well. We welcomed Congress granting us full Medicaid funding formula and asked that the cap be lifted as well to attract more services and physicians. LBJ hospital improvements are needed, as the Army Corps report to Congress pointed out. We're grateful to this committee's directing DOI to study the cost of repairing and replacing our only hospital, LBJ Tropical Medical Center. The Army Corps report outlines millions are needed for LBJ's modernization. Long-term funding mechanisms need to be looked at by this committee as Congress looks at providing essential and emergency healthcare capabilities and funding for the future. An increase to the annual ASG operations at DOI OIA is needed to help us further plan and design an effective modernization in accord with the Army Corps findings. More unemployment assistance is needed. Pandemic unemployment assistance payments of $600 expired July 31. But applications locally are just now being processed since we've had no local unemployment program. So I thank Secretary Scalia and the US DOL team for their implementation efforts to date. Please include American Samoa in any modification that extends and expands the PUA payment to all our valid workers under local law. 30A extension is needed. I encourage you to support multi-year continuation of the 30A American Samoa Economic Development Credit. Our sole remaining tuna canneries, 2 others have left for cheap foreign labor. It's nearly 20% of the workforce at 3,000 plus jobs, and it relies heavily on the 30A tax credit. We cannot diversify our local economy without a 5-year minimum extension. No business will invest in a developing territory when a job creation credit expires every year and is always uncertain of being renewed. We also need 30A to be included in any stimulus tax credit provision or qualifying list under IRS Section 38 or otherwise as well. Finally, increasing highway funding formula for the territories and providing additional grant opportunities for seawall construction and safer ports should be a part of any broad infrastructure stimulus. In closing, I want to thank our governor and our healthcare workers and first responders during this crisis, and thank our military, and note that American Samoa has one of the highest rates of service in the Army per capita and the highest rate of service per capita in NFL linemen, and proudly play in college at West Virginia and all over. It takes a real tough Samoan to be a mountaineer in a lava. Thank you, Chairman Murkowski, Ranking Member Manchin, and committee members for your time today. God bless.
Thank you, Congresswoman. I was wondering where you were taking that picture with the NFL lineman. Let us now turn to Congresswoman Plaskett. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. Give us the view from U.S. Virgin Islands, please.
Thank you so much, Chairwoman Murkowski and Ranking Member Manchin. You also have testimony submitted by Governor Albert Bryant of the U.S. Virgin Islands, and I think that will as well be informative along with my testimony. The impact of the COVID virus in the territories has been tremendous. In the Virgin Islands, like other territories, the impact of disaster, economic recessions are always much more negative in the territories than it is on the mainland. The first COVID case in the Virgin Islands was confirmed on March 13th. On that day, Governor Albert Bryant declared a local state of emergency. And on April 2nd, President Trump approved Governor Bryant's request for major disaster declaration. We are presently in the open door phase of the Virgin Island. And as of Monday, June 29th, the Virgin Islands Department of Health has identified 84 positive cases with 5 remaining active cases, 73 recovered cases, and 6 deaths. With the assistance of our federal partners, we're better supplied now than at the beginning. However, we remain concerned about the full and timely replacement of personal protective equipment, swabbing, and testing. We received $3.5 million federal support from the Provider Relief Fund, but as airlines and visitors return to the territory, we are concerned about that. As you know, the Virgin Islands is uniquely dependent on tourism. It generates 30% of the territory's gross domestic product and employs 25% of our civilian labor force. Because the COVID-19 impact reduced tourism revenues essentially to zero, the territory is suffering devastating economic losses. As I will discuss, the most support needed for the Virgin Islands' recovery from COVID is economic. The scale of the economic calamity is such that even sweeping relief provided by CARES Act, while very much appreciated, is inadequate to prevent the territory from falling off our economic cliff. Economic models have projected a revenue shortfall of $250 million in 2020. That's 25% of our annual budget. And another $250 million in 2021, another 25% of our annual budget. The sudden and dramatic drop in government revenues has reduced the territory's cash on hand to dangerously low levels, days of cash on hand, jeopardizing our ability to make payroll and perform basic public services. Unemployment claims jumped 100% between March and April, from 4.2% unemployment to 8.4%, while government revenues drops to unprecedented lows. Tourist expenditures average $1.2 billion a year as the territory brings in hundreds of thousands of air arrival and cruise visitors. Typically, there's an average of 178 and 644 cruise ship visitors in March, based on data from 2013 to 2019. However, in March 2020, there were only 78,000, or 43% of a typical monthly average, due to the global suspension of cruise ship activities that started on March 14th. It is unclear when we will receive even close to that monthly average again. The CARES Act have ameliorated some of the harm, and we appreciate that, but it will not prevent serious and lasting damages to the Virgin Islands economy. Let's think about it. We received $75 million. While the Virgin Islands population is approximately 1/5 the size of the smallest state, under the CARES Act, we received 1/17 the minimum funding of a smallest state. This is inequitable. The pandemic doesn't distinguish between an individual or a virus in the territories or the United States, and help available to American citizens threatened should not be either. As a result, the Virgin Islands will need a significant infusion of operating funding for fiscal year 20 and 21, covering both the outlays for coronavirus expenses and the loss of revenues. Otherwise, it will fall far short of the revenue loss of the pandemic. I have pages more to discuss, but I really just want to impress on you all the impact financially to the territories because of the pandemic. We have already faced significant losses and concern over the hurricanes, as you discussed. We're recovering from 2 Category 5 hurricanes, community disaster loan debt payments, FEMA local cost share for recovery funding. That has already crippled our economy. But now to have to deal with this pandemic, where 25% of our revenues have lost, inequitable treatment in how we are going to be receiving funds, Congress has got to do better. It is Congress's responsibility to take care of the territories. That, along with tax implications of the tax bill from this last tax bill and the 2004 one, which drove out economic diversification of our economy, we have got to make some changes that deal not just with the disaster right now, but the underlying fundamental economic disparities that are in the territories, which keep us from being able to keep up. So I've gone over my time. I will submit and answer any questions that you all have. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Congresswoman. Let's next go to Congresswoman Gonzalez Colon from Puerto Rico.
Thank you, Chairman Murkowski and Ranking Member Manchin. As Puerto Rico's sole representative in Congress for this invitation today in this hearing, I have submitted a more detailed version of my testimony to the committee, so I will go over some of immediate priorities during this time, and knowing as well that the governor of Puerto Rico submitted for the record her position. On March 15, Puerto Rico became the first U.S. jurisdiction to implement the strictest lockdown with a mandatory curfew and a shutdown of all non-essential businesses. COVID-19, coupled with the 2017 hurricanes and this year's earthquakes, have created major unexpected challenges for a territory that, because of its colonial political status and the inability to fully participate in our nation's democracy, has always considerably lagged the states economically. One way to facilitate our recovery will be to include in any future emergency relief package language similar to the ones that I adopted from the Bicameral Congressional Task Force, H.R. 302, the Child Tax Credit, H.R. 754, the Earned Income Tax Credit, that will provide equal treatment under both of these programs and an immediate impact on low-income families in Puerto Rico, which has a poverty level of 43.1, the highest in the nation. Congress should transition Puerto Rico's SNAP to SNAP. Under the Family First and the CARES Act, we received $297 million in supplemental funding for a capped block grant, which is funded at $1.96 billion and serve over 1.3 million beneficiaries on the island, with benefits close to 50% less than SNAP, which is in the States, and we don't have the disaster portion of the SNAP program. However, this will not be enough to cover the actual demand. Congress should increase our capped grant by 30% to $2.5 billion and provide additional $1.27 billion for NAP just to cover the current ongoing health emergency, because we are going to the regular numbers in August. Also, Puerto Rico was not included in the pandemic EBT program, which provides nutritional benefits to students in light of school closures, which started in mid-March and are still closed to this day. We have 218,000 students enrolled in child nutrition programs. Having access to the pandemic EBT will help counter food insecurity and hunger in those kids. The Family First allowed testing for the uninsured, FMAP, with 100% FMAP, even though the ongoing Medicaid funding cap for the territories was raised for 3.5% in this year and 3.3% for the next year, but the expenses for the uninsured remain 100% FMAP. That means that together with the testing and the treatment for Medicaid beneficiaries, that will result in additional spending, causing Puerto Rico to use up its capped Medicaid funding more quickly. Congress should exempt the coverage of the uninsured for the Medicaid capped, or, what I prefer, eliminate the capped, which is not placed in the states. In Puerto Rico, the vast majority of Medicare beneficiaries receive their care through the local Medicare Advantage organizations, which account for nearly 50% of all healthcare expenses on the island. Congress should also provide emergency funding to providers of Medicare Advantage, so its funding can prevent hospitals from firing essential personnel during the emergency. Providers in Puerto Rico so far receive the lowest amount per capita of distribution of $23 compared to the national per capita of $174. Also, the providers in Puerto Rico are receiving $930 compared to the national medium of $9,700. That's the reason that will be taken into account. This pandemic also demonstrated that firsthand the risk posed by our country's heavy reliance on foreign manufacturing of medical supplies. We need to increase domestic production of medical goods. That's why we introduced H.R. 6443, which is a bipartisan bill that would establish federal tax incentives for current and repatriated manufacturing operations in distress zones in areas of the whole nation. There are extremely high poverty and prevalent unemployment across the nation. This bill will also incentivize research, development, and manufacturing of population health drugs that, because of their low cost, are especially prone of offshoring. Puerto Rico can play a leading role in our efforts to bring back that manufacturing to the U.S. 12 of the top 20 pharmaceutical and biotechnology companies in the world have manufacturing operations in Puerto Rico. We also manufacture half of the 2018 world's top 10 most sold drugs. Puerto Rico is also home to medical devices manufacturing sites, producing surgical and medical instruments like Medtronic and Abbott. Puerto Rico has a long history of pharmaceutical manufacturing and accounts with a highly skilled workforce. The island's university system has also invested in a highly skilled workforce by turning out a steady stream of new talent, highly sought by the likes of NASA. This bill will have a unique opportunity to bring jobs back to the United States and spur the economy of distressed zones like areas like Puerto Rico. I look forward for answering any questions you may have and provide additional details. And in the line of tourism, just with the COVID-19, we got 128 calls of cruise ship canceled. 53 of them were home ports, 75 of them were transit. That means more than 350,000 passengers less to the last year. And again, the cruises industry, major cruise line have extended their sailing suspension to September. So that means that it will be 183 cancels. So that, my time is over. Thank you.
Thank you, Congresswoman. Appreciate that. And finally, we will hear from the Congressman from Guam, the Honorable Michael San Nicolas.
Good afternoon and Hafa Chairwoman Murkowski, Ranking Member Manchin, and members of the committee. I want to thank you for your leadership and advocacy in our combined efforts to provide equitable access of federal resources to the people of Guam and our U.S. territories in this global fight against the COVID-19 pandemic. In assessing our COVID-19 circumstances and evaluating what further action must be taken federally in order to fully meet the needs of our territories, we can find one very specific parallel to the pandemic itself. Pre-existing conditions exacerbate risk factors. For Guam in particular, the pre-existing conditions of unfunded earned income tax credit mandates, the lack of supplemental security income applicability, and the underfunded costs of the migratory impacts and the compacts of free association left us vulnerable and stall our efforts to recover. From inception, the EITC costs for Guam have ballooned to roughly 30% of total income tax refund liabilities on Guam. The very nature of the EITC is that it is intended to pay a qualified recipient an amount in excess of their total banked income tax withholdings in order to incentivize work. While the EITC as a broad federal program is sustainable, with the U.S. Treasury able to fund those costs using various deficit spending tools, applying them to Guam and leaving Guam to fund them is wholly unsustainable because the territory does not have similar access to such tools. As a result of this pre-existing condition, Guam's capacity to meet COVID-19 threats was greatly diminished, with less facility readiness and nurse recruitment and retention already inadequate to meet Guam's needs. The Congress must see to it that the federal government absorbs the cost of EITC by permanently funding it on a reimbursement basis in the territories. Additional thought should be put into a Federal Reserve facility to capitalize EITC costs to territories and direct payments from the Treasury to the Fed at the close of the fiscal year to reconcile it. When the pandemic struck and our tourism-based economy contracted, we have seen many families go from making ends meet to not being able to provide. We must recognize the pre-existing challenges facing our at-risk community and how their situations went from bleak to destitute as a result of the pandemic. At its core, Supplemental Security Income, SSI, is intended to serve as a lifeline for those who qualify, particularly the aged and the disabled, who otherwise would have little means to provide for their basic needs. The lack of SSI on Guam means that thousands of children and families go without what otherwise would be a staple of American decency throughout this country. Prior to the pandemic, this at-risk group was cared for by aging parents and gracious family members, many of whom worked multiple jobs to supplement the cost of living and care for their loved ones. This pre-existing condition already strained households, and the economic savaging of the pandemic has caused people to not only lose their jobs, but lose the ability to care for the disabled loved ones who would be supported by SSI had they not been statutorily excluded. The Congress must end the discriminatory exclusion of territories from SSI. Recent federal court rulings are already indicating that such an outcome is forthcoming. It will be both pragmatic and magnanimous for the Congress to fully extend SSI to the territories, particularly during these COVID-19 times, so that the people most in need, even before the pandemic, are finally made whole during the pandemic. As the renegotiations for the Compacts of Free Association implementation agreements begin in earnest, we must be mindful of how the pre-existing condition of these agreements have created critical health, education, and public safety vulnerabilities in the territory of Guam. To avail of the freedom to migrate, COFA citizens must either be doing so for education, healthcare, or employment. The costs associated with hosting COFA migrants under either of these three prerequisites have vastly exceeded current funding levels. In 2019, the rate of federally funded compact impact per COFA migrant was $892, which is far short of the cost to educate at over $9,000, the cost for government health care at almost $3,000, and the cost of EITC should they be working and receiving that benefit at $2,800 on a per-citizen basis on Guam. These shortfalls create real systemic imbalances and ripe pre-existing conditions for COVID-19 to go untested, untreated, or undiagnosed, as COFA migrants are ineligible for Medicaid coverage and the cash shortfall of underfunded migratory costs overburden the systems of care. The Congress must strive to provide as much balance as possible to the costs associated with hosting COFA migrants, as failure to do so comes at a cost to health, education, and public safety institutions provided by host communities. The Congress must also extend the applicability of Medicaid to COFA migrants as a common sense component of the authorized migratory purpose of seeking health care, and further consider extending Medicaid directly into COFA states as a means to ameliorate health care migration at the source. Addressing these pre-existing conditions will certainly improve the outcome of all COVID-19 relief provided and permanently strengthen the Guam community to better withstand any future threats. While they represent long-standing issues within the territory of Guam, these pandemic circumstances have revealed the structural weaknesses caused by their systemic corrosion. To ensure our COVID-19 relief efforts are fully effective, and to ensure that Guam and our territories are properly situated for any future risks, we must address the EITC, SSI, and COFA inequities now, not later. Thank you, Chairwoman Murkowski and Ranking Member Manchin and members of the committee for the opportunity to testify before you today. I stand ready to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you so very much, and appreciate the testimony of each of you here today. I'm going to start off. There's been a great deal of focus, as there necessarily should be, on the economic impact due to COVID-19. But I'm going to start my questions off with regard to healthcare capacity. As I look through the numbers out there, all of the island territories are very similar to Alaska in that you've got either a mandatory 14-day quarantine or requires some level of testing, as we do in Alaska. The question to you is that I understood that in the early days of the COVID testing, the results were either flown to Hawaii for testing or to Atlanta for results, which of course just adds to the days and sometimes weeks to get a turnaround. Has that been resolved? Do you have the ability to get test results on island at this point in time in all 5 that are represented today? Puerto Rico says yes, Guam, yes, USVI. How about out in CNMI and American Samoa?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. And then I think it was you, Congresswoman Plaskett, that mentioned that replacement PPE was, there was a worry or a concern about, are there any other medical equipment shortages, PPP, that you all are currently worried about, that FEMA is not being responsive, that HHS is not being responsive, that you have not addressed here today, that any one of you would wish to share with us? And I'll start with our 2 individuals that are online, either Congresswoman Radawagan or Congressman Sablan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. In the beginning, when I'm not sure if it was at the direction of FEMA or if it was locally, but the Commonwealth government purchased testing agents, reagents, and test swabs from a company from South Korea, and the swabs were not approved, CDC approved or FDA approved. Subsequent to that, I asked Dr. Fauci if he could help get FDA to approve it, and eventually they're now approved. But there was recently also a raid by FBI on the company, both on Guam and on Saipan, it's the same company that sold us those unauthorized swabs and reagents.
Okay.
Thank you.
Anything else, Congresswoman, or any of the panelists here?
I just wanted to add that, yes, we have the supplies that we need, and FEMA is very responsive because they're on the ground already in the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico related to our other disaster. We also have capacity issues just based on our hospitals not having the facilities in the manner that they're supposed to be. On the island of St. Croix, we are just this past couple of weeks put up the temporary facility before the rebuild of our hospital from the 2017. So having the beds necessary if there's a surge has been a problem that we are dealing with. And because the territories, the smaller territories, also are still being reimbursed based on TEFRA rather than on another reimbursable, there's a question of whether or not we're going to be able to get the add-on payments that are needed if those patients are Medicaid or Medicare.
So and I was out there in St. Croix and saw the devastation to that hospital. Incredible to see what you had experienced and then to recognize just how long it was going to be until you actually had another facility.
Right.
I know that Congresswoman Rodawagan, you also mentioned American Samoa's LBJ hospital. I haven't seen that one myself, but it kind of speaks to the capacity issues that you face when, fortunately for American Samoa, you do not have any cases. You want to keep it that way. But your capacity is limited, at least in a couple of these areas, because you've had a disaster visit you before, and we haven't been able to get on top of that to this point in time.
And while FEMA and Army Corps are very good about identifying other locations and putting up the beds and the capacity that's needed, the cost of that, the share that we have to pay for each one of those beds is really exorbitant.
So,
Congresswoman?
One of the issues that is related to that hospital capacity is actually that hospitals in Puerto Rico use 50% for Medicaid Advantage. So although Family First and CARES had included money for Medicaid, many of those hospitals are firing personnel, essential personnel, because they're not having any activity or payments or advancement by a Medicare Advantage program. And that's not only in Puerto Rico, that's happened in Florida, Oregon, and many other states. But in our case, that represents more than 50%. So even when we do have 3,800 beds in use, of them, just 102 for COVID, and more than 2,400 available, that doesn't mean that the hospitals are going to continue to maintain their operations because they're not receiving the Medicaid Advantage fund. So that is a critical issue, and we saw a lot of layoff from hospitals and nurses during this emergency time, at least on the island.
Appreciate that.
Chairman Murkowski,
Go ahead, you can finish up.
the funds from the CARES Act are being used at LBJ for coronavirus-related expenditures, which totaled more than $3.6 million and includes over $1.3 million in medical equipment, nearly $2 million in medical supplies, and $320,000 in infrastructure costs. According to LBJ, the hospital anticipates more expenditures for more COVID-19 project supplies and equipment. And just to make a long story short, as of June 14th, total test kits on hand is 3,300, with 1,800 test kits for the Gene Expert testing machine reserved to test symptomatic patients, and 1,500 test kits for the Abbott ID now being used. So we're okay so far.
Good, good. Senator Manchin.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. And first, I'd like to start with Congresswoman Rodawagan. Since you have no reported cases in American Samoa, can you tell us about what time period you all took action when you had heard of the COVID-19? And this will probably go down to all of you all. But your timetable and what you did immediately that you think was able to have the outcome you've had so far.
Yes, Ranking Member Manchin, the borders were closed. right away in March.
Early,
And,
was that early March, about March 19th, or earlier than that?
About the third week in March, I believe. It
Okay.
was. And commercial flights were suspended, and they still are suspended as of now. And it's been a big help, but we do have a lot of angry constituents who are stuck up in the States, want to come home, and want to go up to the States. But that has been very effective for us. And as you mentioned, the Spanish flu in 1918, it's exactly what they did. They closed the borders.
And we'll just go right down if we can. Sablon, Congressman Sablon?
Yeah, thank you, Senator Manchin. We did as well. We closed just around the same time. Our tourists come from South Korea, China, and Japan primarily. And we closed just as early as we could, although we were, I think, a week or two behind, but still we were blessed and we were very fortunate that we had no tourists coming into the Marianas. There were two missionaries from the Philippines who came to Saipan and visited Saipan, and they both came. They were already infected, and they're the only two infected individuals that actually passed away. But we have been just very lucky, thank God.
Congressman Plasky?
I would say that we closed early, and our numbers remained very low until just recently. Most of our infections have been travel-related. That is
When you open back up?
Right, yes, sir. Our governor closed our hotels. While he was unable to close the airlines, the fact that there were not hotel rooms meant that people were not able to come. And Virgin Islanders, like the other territories, are used to disaster. So when the governor says everything is shut down, people usually comply. We understand that. We've just in this week started to have some community transmissions. That's a concern. And so thankfully, we will begin the tracing. We have been doing a good job of the tracing as well. But I think shutting down early and people following has been what has helped us. Wouldn't you say, Jennifer?
In our case, in Puerto Rico, of 3.3 million, we got 1,600 cases confirmed molecular test and 5,700 serological test probable cases for a total of 7,400. But again, Puerto Rico closed. It was in a strict curfew and shut down in March 15. So we were the first jurisdiction in the nation to do that. And right now, the governor just yesterday announced that there's going to be a new requirement for all passengers arriving to Puerto Rico to provide a test, molecular test or serological test before arriving to the island. We're doing those tests on site. They're voluntarily right now, but there's going to be a requirement of providing at least 72 hours before arriving. And if you are not compliant with that, you're going to have a 14-day quarantine on the island.
We closed early as well, Senator, similar to our colleagues in the CNMI around the same time. What the reality is on the ground now, however, is because of these social programs that I mentioned earlier not applying to Guam and the various impacts that it's having on our local revenue streams, we're really running into that very real sticky place where, you know, people want to stay safe and secure and not bring the virus in, but we're such a tourism-dependent economy that if we don't open up and if we don't begin having flights coming in, the financial circumstances are going to result in perhaps equally damaging healthcare realities for many of our people. And so in the earlier question, Senator Murkowski, about the PPE needs, while FEMA has been wonderful and HSS has been wonderful in meeting our status quo needs, the reality is when we bring these tourists in, we're going to have an exponential need. We have 160,000 people living on Guam, but we bring in 1.6 million tourists a year, the most per capita than anywhere else in the country. If we don't have PPE for those visitors, we're just going to be inviting catastrophe. And once that spirals out of control, the tourism will shut down all over again. And so we have a very unique set of circumstances where we need to understand that opening up eventually is going to have to happen. But we're also going to need the resources and the plans in place in order to do so responsibly so that it's sustainable.
Let me just say, if I can take one more liberty here. We know the economies are all struggling in all states and all territories. So we know that the economy is not going to come back until we have an antibody or a vaccine to where people feel safe, that they can really go out and operate as we've done before. So with not the economy coming back the way you would like for it to, can you, real quickly, just all of you, what's your greatest need you have? You think, is food going to be the greatest concern you have sustaining your citizens? Is it going to be your healthcare services, being able to sustain your healthcare services that they might be needing? What would you term or define as your greatest need? And I would assume you all are looking forward to another round of COVID assistance,
Well,
the CARES Act.
Senator, from our perspective, we were able to provide some unique set of eyes in that our unemployment program is only now getting stood up. And so we can kind of give you an example of what happens when unemployment isn't around anymore. On top of that, the eviction moratoriums are expiring on the 25th of July. The federal pandemic unemployment compensation is expanding at the end of July. And so we're going to be facing multiple threats. Right now, because unemployment has taken so long to roll out, we have people literally lining up at 2 in the morning in their cars waiting for food assistance to get handed out. And they'll wait for 4 hours, and then when they show up, when they finally make it up to the front of the line, food's out. And so, food can be looked at as one definite need, but definitely healthcare, and it's all multifaceted. The reality is, until our economies are working again, those are all going to be needs, to include rental assistance, housing assistance. And so, as my colleague from the CNMI mentioned earlier, the HEROES Act does provide a significant amount of support that we think would help carry us into where a vaccine will probably be available. But absent any additional COVID relief, similar to the CARES Act and on a continuous and ongoing basis, particularly for our tourism-oriented economies, we're going to be in a very bad place.
In the case of Puerto Rico, I think the PPP is a very important program, and everything is going to be in during this summer, equal to unemployment. I will say that healthcare is one of the most important in terms of Medicare, and of course the food assistance through NAP, and I will say EBT. In the agricultural program, I don't know what is that happened with the territories, although we all qualify, in the case of Puerto Rico, all specialty crops like coffee, bananas, plantains, many other of our products are not listed as qualifying. So our farmers are not eligible to receive all that was approved just because our crops in the Caribbean or in the islands are not listed as the main ones. We sent letters to address that issue, so we are waiting for USDA just to clarify. But at least in our case, we're talking about mangoes, pineapple, all lettuce, peppers, jams, cilantro, passion fruit, many others. All the island produce is not included as a regular crop.
I'm sorry.
Right, if I may, also, Senator, of the Northern Marianas, we have a cap on Medicaid like the rest of the territories. And just as of April, just after the COVID, and of course, people lost their jobs, and an additional 2,606 individuals are signed up for Medicaid, qualified for Medicaid. And right now, Medicaid covers over 50% of the total U.S. citizens in the Marianas. As of the swaps, for example, and reagents, as of yesterday, testing supplies available are the Solj and the Korean products, 1,502 test kits. The Abbott ID is 3,474, and the Gene Expert is 2,749. So yeah, we could expect to see these things run out in very short time. Thank you.
Senator, I believe it's economic, the support for unemployment, and the equitable treatment if there are funding to states to have that funding to go to the territories, which are going to take a long time in coming back up, I think are the most important.
The short answer for American Samoa is all of the above. We need everything. As a matter of fact, I would say almost 90% of the goods and supplies are imported. And many of the things that are taken for granted in the United States and the nation are things that we still have a tremendous need for. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Manchin. Let's go to Senator Hirono, who is online.
Madam Chair. It's good to see all of you. Thank you so much for coming to tell us what's happening in your countries. So I have a question for Representative San Nicolas. So Hawaii and Guam are home to sizable populations of COFA citizens who are not covered under Medicaid. And this happened, in my view, inadvertently when the 1996 so-called Welfare Reform Act was enacted. And so the pandemic has underscored the need for everyone to be covered by health insurance, and access to health care are really important. So last July, I introduced the Covering Our FAS Allies Act in the Senate, and I'm thankful to you, Representatives Zablan and Radowagan, for co-sponsoring the House Companion Bill. How would restoring Medicaid benefits to COFA citizens by passing the Covering Our FAS Allies Act improve on Guam's ability to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic?
Thank you very much, Senator, for the question. Because COFA migrants are not covered under Medicaid, they fall under what Guam refers to as the medically indigent program, which is basically 100% local funded care to be able to be provided for the COFA migrant. Because we're not able to use those funds to get the matching that we're able to get under Medicaid, we basically are suffering from a loss of buying power, significant loss of buying power. Because right now, I think with recent legislation passed, I believe that we're able to get over 80% Medicaid matching now for every Medicaid dollar that Guam spends. But we're not able to do that for the COFA migrants. So basically, we're suffering from not being able to service 3 times as many migrants who might need COFA treatments because we're not able to leverage our dollar using Medicaid matching resources.
So it would make a huge difference to Guam as well as to Hawaii, and there are other places now, Arkansas, there are other places where COFA citizens live and they are not covered under Medicaid, and so it would make a huge difference. For Hawaii, it would mean a difference of millions and millions of dollars. So I want to thank the members of the House, all of you, for putting this item into, I believe it's in your CARES Act. Thank you very much. A question for Congresswoman Radowagan. Both of our both for where you are, American Samoa, Hawaii, we are very dependent on air travel for our tourists, of course. And right now, we do not have national standards for how to reopen air travel safely. And I have written a letter to the Department of Transportation, Homeland Security, Secretary of State, and others for them to work together to come up with common standards that everyone can follow, rather than all the airlines doing their own thing, the states, their airports, everybody doing their own thing. Knowing how important travel is to both American Samoa and, in fact, all of our territories, do you agree that we should have national standards to enable air travel to open safely?
Well, right offhand, it makes a lot of sense.
What about the rest of you? Do you agree?
I'm reluctant to impose national standards on airlines throughout the country. And I think, however, that it's Congress's responsibility to continually question and have some oversight over the airlines as they engage in what their practices are going to be. You know, there are constitutional issues that kind of make me cringe when I think about what may need to be done for our airlines and airports, restrictions that can and cannot work. And, you know, I'm looking to see what your bill looks like, Senator. That would be very interesting to review, to see how that can be done in a manner that's safe for all Americans, but still keeps businesses competitive and independent.
Senator, if I may.
Actually, Representative Plaskett, it is not a bill. It is a request to the federal agencies that have oversight over various aspects of air travel to come together with some common kinds of standards. And for example, the FAA imposes all kinds of standards on our airlines and our airports all the time. So this is really a request that we have some common standards, because what you're now going to face are different airports having different requirements, different airlines having
Right.
different requirements, and it makes air travel pretty tough, I would say.
Yes, it
And
does.
since we're so dependent, it's not a bill. I hope that you all can agree with me that that would probably be a good thing.
Thank you.
Congressman Zablon, would you like to add anything to that? If not, I'll go on to the next question.
Yeah, no, I'm willing to look at what you're offering, Senator Hirono. I just flew in. I have to fly through Guam, spend
Yes.
a whole day in Guam, fly to Hawaii, San
Yes.
Francisco, Houston, then DC. It is difficult, and it's scary to ride in an airplane.
Not to mention, by the way, that the CARES Act and the COVID bills provided billions for the airlines.
Yes.
And now they're getting back to pretty much packing their airplanes. And I don't think that is what the CDC is recommending in terms of spacing and social distancing. So, I think we need to remain very concerned about what's going on with
Right.
air travel.
Between San Francisco and Honolulu, there's actually a full flights up in the pharmacy.
Yeah, and I think that's not particularly safe. Madam Chair, am I over my time? I can't tell.
Yes, Senator Hirono, you are.
Thank you.
Thank
I'll
you.
submit my other questions, but thank the panelists.
Senator Hirono, thank you. I think you offer a very important perspective coming from our islanded state. Several of you, just about everybody, does have, to some extent, a reliance on the cruise industry to bring your tourists. And for many of you, it is a significant part of your tourist base. We've been talking about the restrictions and limitations on air travel, and believe me, in Alaska, we know what it means to have your summer visitors decide that they're going to go somewhere else when they look and see that, well, there's a 14-day quarantine if I come to your state, and I don't want to spend my whole vacation in a hotel somewhere. So that's not a good option for us. For us, we were expecting 1.4 million tourists to come to Alaska this summer on cruise ships. And as you all have indicated, we are, as they say, dead in the water. There are no cruise ships that are coming, possibly in September, but it doesn't make for a season. And for us, that season is over in September. Much as everybody wants to come to Alaska, they don't view it as their winter vacation, and that's why they don't sell those cruises then. But for you all, that is an opportunity when the industry kind of gets back to work here. But I recognize that right now we have an industry that is not ready to receive the passengers, and in many of the communities don't want to receive people that are coming off of a cruise ship. So the question that I would have to you, and all of you who welcome the cruise industry to your regions, is what movement you've seen from the CDC to work to develop these health and safety protocols so that not only do the passengers feel that it's safe to get on these ships, but the communities feel safe in receiving them. Because I know in Alaska's experience, we have several of our communities that have said, as much as we want the revenues that are going to come in when you stop, we're not sure that we want to run that risk if this is still high risk for COVID. So if you can speak to that, Ms. Gonzalez.
Madam Chair,
Congresswoman.
we agree on what you're experiencing in Alaska. We're having the same thing in San Juan, which is our major port for cruise ships. And having said that, they're going to be suspended, all cruise ships to December. Right now, the impact between March 14 and now is pretty much $66 million. At least in Puerto Rico. So we were talking about a direct impact in tourism. Even though tourism is 7% of the GDP of the island, many people think that that number is higher. It's just 7%. We're talking about the airlines coming to the island as well, passengers. We got several airports, and now we're just serving San Juan as a way to try to receive all of them and do the voluntary test. The National Guard in Puerto Rico are doing voluntary tests of all passengers that are arriving. But again, if you are not complying with that, that's the reason the new executive order from the governor requested 72 hours before a test be made by the passenger. And I know, as the senator was explaining before, and I agree with Congresswoman Plaskett, is the issue that we can do that, Hawaii can do that, or any different jurisdiction, but we need to have a uniform way to address this issue. Not just where the passenger is coming from, but how we're going to comply with legal issues and at the same time, how you balance health and economy, because we need to learn how to live with this. Because today is COVID-19, but maybe in several months it's going to be another virus. So we need, in terms of the CDC or what are going to be the guidelines, we need a hearing in the House, not just in the T&I Committee, Transportation and Infrastructure, but several others, just for the tourism industry, about cruises and planes, because we don't want to lose a lot of the airplanes routes that are serving smaller airports across our island. And I assume that's the same thing happening in Alaska. Because one thing is the international airport, but the local ones are right now directly impacted because all those flights are canceled.
And some of those companies are now going bankrupt.
Senator,
Congresswoman
may
Plaskett.
I point something out that I find really interesting about how we attempted to deal with CARES Act and the economic impact? We have, the CARES Act put money in airports. We gave money to airlines. We also gave to local economies based on the number of individuals infected. But there has not been money given to marine ports. You know, for us, like Puerto Rico and these other islands, our ports are our lifeline. For supplies, Senator Manchin, like you were talking about food and others, there's not been funding given to that. And there have not been given funding to places like Alaska and others that were reliant on cruise ship passengers and what that means to their economies. We spent a lot of time focused on airlines throughout this, whether it's CDC guidelines for how airlines were going to open, but not much effort has been put on shipping, ports, and these cruise lines. And I think that's something that we're recognizing, and I'm glad you raised that question, because I don't think there's been a lot of effort put in there.
And I think it is something that we need to be engaged with the CDC on this to make sure that, again, it's not just, but that there is this back and forth, if you will, in terms of understanding what these protocols are, and a recognition that we are dealing with health safety issues, but we are also dealing with significant economic repercussions as well. So let me turn to Senator Manchin.
My heart goes out to all of you, it really does. And I've been able to visit some, and I've enjoyed every time I've been there. But I know on top of the disasters, the natural disasters, the hurricanes coming through, children still trying to recover from that, and then hitting on top of this, and the economy's flattening out completely. I don't know what the next round's going to be. I really can't tell you that. It's not going to be as robust as the House, as you all have done over in the House. But what we want to do is we want to pinpoint. We want to find out, really, and I think we all can help us, all of you. Tell us what hasn't worked. Because we're all different. West Virginia is different than Texas and California. Puerto Rico is going to be a little bit different than Samoa and the Virgin Islands, and we all have different needs. We've got to be able now to do a surgical attack. This has to be a surgical attack the next time, how we're able to help and assist, and where it may be. Unemployment, okay? I'm having a problem with unemployment compensation right now because of $600 on top of unemployment. People won't go back to work. They're just not going back. They won't go back until it runs out on July 31st. Now, but with that being said, you can't take a sinister approach and say, okay, no more. What I thought from day one, it should be keep them whole. Whatever their paycheck was, we'll keep that paycheck whole until we get this economy moving again. We bumped up an incentive, and it really disincentivized people to want to get back into action. It's going to be a rude awakening on July 31st to a lot of people. It's going to stop. Yes, Stacy.
Say something,
Sure.
Senator. One area that I think we need to be careful of, because the territories usually receive reimbursement in terms of stipends, I know for us, our seniors are still waiting for funding for Social Security.
Yeah.
We're still waiting for the IRS and Treasury to send the list to the governors so that they can get that money out to individual. But one of the good things I want to tell a story about is for us, the PPE program for small businesses has worked tremendously well, particularly in the second round of funding when it was targeted towards smaller banks. Because we're in a small community and the banks know the businesses, we were able to get large amounts of our small businesses.
That was the second
able to-
round you're talking
Yes.
about. Yeah, we all got hit. Every rural area in America got hit the same as the islands got hit. Just money wasn't going out to them.
And then how did the second round do for your?
Much better. Oh, yes, much better on that. And we've looked at that. There's a lot of money left. There's over $400 billion left in the large loan programs, which the corporations wouldn't take
Right.
because they didn't want to be held to the strict guidelines that you could not give bonuses and you could not have stock buybacks. So there's a lot of money in play right now that we can transfer, if you will, and surgically put it in areas that's really needed. That's what we're looking at. And we just haven't done enough in evaluating it. We're going to wait till everything runs out and someone says, just throw a chunk of more money to it. And I don't think that's going to happen. So the more we can do right now to surgically help each one of you all, the same as all of our states need help too, is what we really should be doing.
Mr. St. Nicholas, my junior colleague there, who I like reminding him that he's a freshman, has been doing some tremendous work on financial services. And one of the letters that he wrote was about municipal credit facilities, which the territories were not eligible for. The Treasury decided that they were not going to include us. They interpreted on their own that we weren't eligible to receive that funding.
You all did receive, same as the states, every state got a minimum. The smallest states in America got $1.25 billion that went to their states to assist them in trying to help to the expense of coronavirus. Did all of the territories that you all didn't receive?
We did not receive. No.
You received some, but not 1.25, I know that.
Specifically to the municipal liquidity facility that's administered by the Fed, territories are not able to access that at all. And that's an issue because our liquidity is incredibly strained. And I've raised this issue with Chairman Powell, my chairwoman in the FSC committee, Chairwoman Waters raised it today again. They're saying that they're looking at it, but if we can get help to have the Fed really understand that, getting territories access to that liquidity facility is critical at this time.
We did receive the federal funding that each one of the states got. It's just that our percentage was very different than the rest of the states were.
Was it because of the infection rate or?
No, because they decided that they were going to create a separate amount of funding for the territories and then allow us to split that up in the same way that they do Medicaid. They came up with a number that they felt.
Are any of you hurting right now, basically not being able to meet your coronavirus expenses, the expenses directly to the virus?
Oh.
Yes.
You are?
Yes. And Senator Manchin, may I,
Sure.
just as a matter of, a matter of law, the PUA and FPUA, the unemployment compensation, for example, the Department of Labor, U.S. Department of Labor has interpreted that for purposes of the COFA nation citizens who reside in the United States, they have gone instead of interpreting it based on the law, they have gone actually to FEMA and asked FEMA to give them an interpretation on how it's interpreted based on the Stafford Act. Now, the Stafford Act is different. I mean, this unemployment compensation has eligibility requirements for unemployment, especially in the Pacific Island nations. But citizens of COFA are not eligible because the U.S. Department of Labor went to FEMA and got their interpretation in terms of the Stafford Act, which of course they're not eligible, but they meet the eligibility under the CARES Act, unfortunately. And so I'm sure there's a whole lot more in Guam, Hawaii. Just as of last night, I found out that 1,100 citizens of COFA who work for Tyson's are infected. 1,100. That's a large number, and I don't know who's going to pay for their hospital bills.
Senator Manchin, getting back to your question on what hasn't worked, I would say that for American Samoa, getting funding to the people, the SBA waiting period and the deadlines, and the unemployment funds are just beginning to come in. And those are some of the key things that haven't worked for American Samoa.
Thank you, yes.
Mr. Senator, I think one of the issues that we got back home, even when we received the full amount for the state, the municipalities were not allowed to receive because all of them do not meet the 500,000 people threshold. So that's an issue when you got municipalities suffering from the earthquakes, same thing to still recovering from the hurricanes, and then now we got the COVID-19, and as us in the Caribbean now facing the Sahara dust, that is another issue. So housing is an issue for Puerto Rico, and even though we received $20 billion from CDBG funds, not all of them are already on the island. So one of the asks that we're trying to have is, if we can, schools and houses that were impacted by the hurricanes were impacted as well with the earthquakes. So if we can use those funds to repair, no matter if it was the hurricane or the earthquake, those facilities, because right now it's just labeled that money and you can use it to repair in that sense. So it's common sense. You cannot touch the money from the earthquakes to the money from the
Let's see if
hurricanes.
we can help you on that.
Thank you.
It's crazy. Thank you all.
Thank you, Senator Manchin. So that was a great question. What hasn't worked? And I think it's important that we understand from lessons learned. And again, I think we recognize that when we put in place the CARES Act, we were moving a lot of money out real quick, and we were going to either undershoot or overshoot or miss the mark altogether. And we've learned, we've made some adjustments on that. Some of them have not come in a very timely manner, but they've come. But if we're going to be moving forward in yet another round, it doesn't make sense to just add money to a program that has clearly demonstrated that it fails certain constituencies. And if we need to make those adjustments, we need to do just that. As I think about how this country, our territories move forward, and thinking about economic recovery, so much of it is in what you all have outlined with regards to things that are just really critically important when it comes to healthcare and Medicaid and just all of the reimbursement issues. But I want to talk hard infrastructure just for a moment, because there's a lot of discussion around here. Oh yeah, we're going to do an infrastructure bill. Well, we've been talking about that for a long while. We're running out of daylight here. But one of the things that we have really come to appreciate, I think, during this time of COVID is that our healthcare, our education system is made stronger. If you have good broadband, you've got the ability to do telehealth or distance learning. So I'm curious to know from those of you if internet broadband is a consideration, an issue for you. In other hard infrastructure, I know that we passed legislation here 5 years ago directing DOI to develop energy action plans for
Thank
the
you.
territories. And so, you
Come
know,
on, Mike.
that often is viewed at energy infrastructure to deliver clean energy solutions where you're not relying on diesel that is shipped in, is something that I think we all look to as a future. Congresswoman Gonzalez, you mentioned the Puerto Rico Aqueduct and Sewer Authority, the Water Smart grants, recognizing that, again, when you're talking about a pandemic, it's really important that you have clean water for your citizens. So as we think about infrastructure, I'd be curious to hear from the five of you what could be beneficial from an economic recovery perspective that you would classify in this particular bucket. And we'll go down this direction. So we'll start with you, Congressman San Nicolas.
Thank you, Senator. I'd first like to recognize my colleague, Congresswoman Plaskett, because she's done tremendous work to increase the allotment for our roadways in the territories. And that's being included in our infrastructure bill in the House that we're currently working on. I know that my colleague also, Congresswoman Gonzalez-Colon, actually wanted to increase that amount further. Roadway infrastructure is a serious issue, especially on Guam. Our weather conditions make for a very short lifespan for even a well-built road. On top of that, because we don't have the same kind of investment in public transportation that a lot of the states have, you have a lot of drivers on these roads. And so road wear and tear from use, road wear and tear from environmental conditions result in a lot of road work that needs to be taken care of. And so these additional road resources are very welcomed, but I would like to ask if there is a way for us to consider, at least for our territories, those road resources are specifically for routed roads, but we have a lot of secondary roads on our island that do not have any kind of funding resources. They are perhaps, not perhaps, they absolutely are in worse shape than our federally routed roads that do have the federal resources. And with the COVID-19 circumstances and our tax revenue base dropping out of the bottom, I don't see any local resources being available to maintain secondary roads anytime soon. And so, I mean, road infrastructure all the way back to the Roman times has been critical for economic sustainability. That's something that I would much like to ask be a priority for the infrastructure bill.
Very good.
In the case of Puerto Rico, I need to say that we are right now having a drought. So beside all the situation, our condition as living in the Caribbean add more pressure to the resources. So we are the only territory, the only state in the whole nation that are excluded from the Water Smart Grant Eligibility Act that actually works with drought resiliency and fresh water. So that's an easy one, right? Just including us as the rest of the states. The second I will say is the rural areas for broadband. There's a reality that right now you need to move forward a lot of schools to go to remote work with kids. We still got a problem with schools in the south part of the island because those municipalities were impacted by the earthquakes. So you get one town like Guanica, all 6 schools are closed. So you really got a situation back home in terms of access to broadband in the rural areas on the island. In terms of the infrastructure for, I'll say ports, being an island, ports should be in the best condition ever, and not just the San Juan area, but the rest of the ports on the island. In terms of we receive a block grant as a territory for roads and highways. Our problem is that having the same metrics that you use for lines and the rest of the states for receiving that allocation, Puerto Rico is just receiving $200 million, when the states that may be compared to us will be receiving 418. So we are asking to remove the cap, or at least increasing the amount of funds going to highways and local roads, because we are not receiving, using the same metrics, the money that should be used for infrastructure. And Puerto Rico's infrastructure serve a lot of the pharmaceutical that supplies the national supply chain and many others. So, and Social Security income, supplemental, SSI. I mean, a lot of our elderly people are not receiving those resources. And you see the poverty level line of 43% is because all this program, instead of having SNAP, which is the program all states got for food assistance, in the territories we receive NAP, at least in Puerto Rico. That means it's less of the funds and resources as well. So I say infrastructure for taking the caps for the block grant, moving us from the rural areas for broadband and in rural areas, and of course, the water smart. And I'm not talking here about energy, that you may know, you were on the island, that we are having a lot of 40% of petroleum, 39% of gas, and 18% of coal, just 2% of renewables. And all this infrastructure suffered by the hurricanes and the earthquakes, and we don't have access yet to the $1.9 billion allocated by Congress to manage the energy area.
There we go. We've got 3 more to finish this up, and then we'll turn to Senator Cantwell. Senator
I'll be
Plaskett.
very quick. In terms of infrastructure, I think one of the major ones is transshipment, which would include ports. But I think we have the potential, and there had been discussion previously about utilizing either Puerto Rico or the Virgin Islands for LNG, transshipment to the rest of the Caribbean. And I think that's something that needs to be put back on the plate. I'm working with a colleague, the Dean of the House from Alaska, Don Young, about support for ferry systems in our areas, which are remote and needed. But I think also your discussion about broadband. In my estimation, broadband is for transportation the same way that the railroads were in the 1800s. It is the way that goods and services, information is going to be transported in this country, and we need to make the investment in it. The Virgin Islands has the largest broadband capacity in the United States outside of New York City, more than Silicon Valley elsewhere, because Global Crossing put their North American hub on the island of St. Croix. But our children have the lowest bandwidth capacity. They have the lowest speed because they do not have that access in that last mile coming to their homes. That's inexcusable. And so the investment in that is really, I think, key to us being also able to grow our economy. So thanks.
That's very interesting information about that. Let's go to Congressman Sablan.
Yeah, thank you. I'd also echo broadband. I come from a place where no less than 60% of our students fall below the poverty level. And so many of them do not have access to broadband. But also in terms of schools, the Army Corps of Engineers did a study in 2013, Senator, and actually made an inventory of school facilities and found that the schools were just in need of repair. A middle school in Saipan, which was built right after the war, has finally was destroyed by our recent super typhoon, and students are now taking classes in tents. Having said that, again, in HR 2 considered today, we had the reopen and restore schools language from the Ed and Labor, and provide money for $100 billion to restore or to catch up with deferred maintenance for school facilities throughout the nation. And so yes, schools are also very in need. And if I may, Senator, the Energy Task Force that was by law assigned to Interior, nothing has come out of that except the organization of the task force. I've been bringing that up twice a year at least.
Yeah,
Thank you.
figured as much. Congresswoman Radewagen, you get the last word here.
Thank you, Chairman Murkowski. With regard to infrastructure, my written testimony that's being submitted addresses many of the details and key needs there for us. But thank you also for bringing up interconnectivity, the internet. I'm not the most tech savvy person, but in short, yes, we need both more high-speed connectivity and more tech training for our young professionals and students at the American Samoa Community College. our only community college. Additional broadband grants will provide this generation with must-have tools to be part of the virtual and teleworking economy that's growing more rapidly than ever due to the ongoing health crisis. And our local CBOT, veterans, also heavily relies on internet connectivity for telehealth. Investment into telecommunications has increasingly become the most important lifeline to the outside world for these remote islands. But we are making progress here, as I am live from 7,000 plus miles away. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for this hearing. If I could go back to Congresswoman Radawagan. Samoa has, I think, no cases so far, but as travel is starting to open up, obviously, we've had various hearings on the Commerce Committee about standards that we'd like to see in the aviation sector so that there are uniform health standards across. What steps do you think need to be taken by the federal government to have confidence in reopening commercial air travel to the island?
Well, I think that I want to compliment the governor here and his task force and the working team on the things that they've put into place that has worked very well for us at this point in time. And I think that, of course, we need more resources, but the federal government has been working closely with the local government to see that we can continue to be the only state or territory that has not a single positive case. And that's a good thing.
And so how do you think people feel about air travel at this point?
Well, I think that there are a lot of angry constituents out there. People want to travel. They always want to travel. And it's been tough for us. We only have one airline, and when that shuts down, nothing moves. And it's really by the grace of God that I happen to get here after spending 2 weeks of quarantine in Hawaii. Then I managed to get on a flight to come down, and then immediately into another 2 weeks of quarantine here in American Samoa. I don't know if I'm answering your question, but
Well, I know, so we all care about air travel, and it's essential for moving goods and services and for our mail, medical supplies. So we want our airlines to operate. I'm asking you because obviously it is so much a part of your economy, tourism. And my feeling is if we get this right and we could get national standards in place, if we could get some distancing and some processes and procedures that had to be followed, you might get to a level where the public feels more comfortable in flying. So we've just been pushing for standards, even if they are, guidelines that would be implemented by all the airlines. So again, we know that American Samoa has a strong tourism economy and probably really counts on this. So we're just looking for the day that we can get that restarted. So thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
yes, and as I mentioned to Senator Hirono, it makes sense. I think it makes sense to take a good look at that.
Thank you, Senator Cantwell. Thank you all. I appreciate what you have provided us. I think there has been a good review on some lessons learned, but also how COVID-19 has really helped shine a spotlight on some of the disparities that we have, not just within how our territories are treated, but some of the disparities that we see here in mainland United States. You look at the vulnerabilities of so many of our minority populations, and you think about how we can work to be responsive, again, not only when it comes to the health and safety of individuals, but then how we are responsive to the economic impact as a follow-on from COVID-19. And it is a challenge. But hearing what you have provided the committee today, I think, is a reminder, certainly to me as a state, that While we're not an island, sometimes we feel like an island up there, not sharing a common border with the rest of the lower 48, but in a recognition of the reliance of your economies on a tourism base that can literally be shut down overnight, and be cut off then for not just the period where the health is at risk, but again, once you lose that season, you lose that season for possibly a year. The fact that so many of our territories are still struggling to recover from various natural disasters, whether it's the hurricanes in the Caribbean or the most recent earthquakes or the typhoons out in the Pacific. These are still very real natural disasters that you haven't even been able to take a deep breath in your recovery to move on to this next. And so I think the reason that we wanted to have this discussion today was to make sure that as we work towards a broader national effort towards recovery, that we are not forgetting our territories. And I don't care, Congresswoman Rodawagan, whether you're 7,000 miles away or you're 700 miles away. We've got a responsibility here, and it's just more challenging in certain places than others because of the geography, but it's respecting the people on the ground wherever they may be. So I think you're probably going to be fielding some questions for the record from other colleagues, and we will appreciate your weighing in. But use us here in the Energy and Natural Resources Committee as a resource. If you have more information following on that you think we need to know in anticipation of the work that we're going to be doing over here in the month of July, that would be very helpful and truly very welcome. So we thank you for your partnership in this, and we thank you for the representation that you provide for your constituents as well. And with that, the committee stands adjourned.